Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we continue following the story of James and Diep, a story that may feel familiar, yet every time it unfolds, it quietly touches the heart with emotions that are deeply real and profoundly human. The previous episode ended with a truth that left the entire family nearly frozen in shock. A truth so simple that no one ever expected it, yet powerful enough to overturn all the emotions that had been building throughout the long day. Little Nie was not kidnapped. There was no bad person lurking nearby. No conspiracy. No sudden disaster striking out of nowhere. It was simply a business trip that ended earlier than expected. It was simply a grandfather, out of love for his grandchild and a desire to make up for lost time, quietly taking her out for a day of fun, forgetting one crucial thing: informing the family. That tiny oversight plunged the entire household into a nightmare that lasted for hours. A nameless fear crept into every unanswered phone call, every confused glance, every racing heartbeat as the worst possible scenarios took shape in everyone's mind. They lived in a suffocating sense of loss. In that moment, no one cared about right or wrong, about responsibility or reasons. All that remained was the fear of losing what mattered most. And then, when the truth finally came to light, when little Nie returned safely into loving arms, relief swept through the house like a gentle breeze. But that relief was not complete. Because alongside it came quiet remorse, unspoken regret, and silent questions that each person asked themselves. And in that seemingly closed moment, a seed of change began to take root. Quietly. Slowly. Yet deeply enough that no one could ignore it. Mr. Hoan had never hidden his dissatisfaction. His attitude was always clear, even rigid, whenever the relationship between James and Diep was mentioned. He opposed their love. In his mind, everything had to be weighed against status and background. Diep, in his eyes, was not a suitable match. A simple background, no strong family backing, and far from the standards he had always upheld. Little Nie, though sweet and well-behaved, was only adopted. Not bound by blood. Not the legitimate grandchild he had once envisioned. And a family like that, according to Mr. Hoan's beliefs, did not deserve to step into the home he had spent his entire life building. These thoughts never needed to be spoken aloud, yet they lingered in every cold glance, every restrained sentence filled with distance. They formed an invisible wall, separating James and Diep from the rest of the family. And so, James and Diep chose to leave. No arguments. No resentment. They quietly built a life of their own, somewhere far enough away that they wouldn't have to face rejection every single day. As for little Nie, she was only occasionally brought back to visit James's mother. Those rare, brief reunions were enough to ease the longing, but never enough to erase a distance that had existed for far too long. That distance wasn't loud. It didn't erupt into open conflict. It lingered silently and persistently, like a small crack stretching across many years. And that very distance is waiting for a moment powerful enough to force everyone to look back, so that no one can turn away in silence ever again. After that incident, the rhythm of life in Mr. Hoan's house slowed in a strangely noticeable way. There were no more packed business trips, no more long stretches of absence like before. He stayed home more often. Not because he was forced to, but as if he himself needed that quiet space to look back at everything that had happened. And it was during this rare period of stillness that, for the first time, Mr. Hoan had the chance to spend so much time with little Nie. Not in fleeting visits. Not in a few polite questions before rushing off again. But in consecutive days, mornings that began with the sound of small footsteps running around the house, and evenings that ended with clear, innocent laughter echoing from a corner of the living room. Nee knew nothing of adult prejudices. She didn't understand what social status meant, nor could she tell the difference between biological family and adoption. To Nee, everything was much simpler. She only knew how to call out, "Grandpa." That call made Mr. Hoan pause at first. Something very faint, very fragile brushed against him, even though he couldn't yet put a name to the feeling. Nee would run over to show off a new toy, her eyes lighting up as she waited for his reaction. She would chatter endlessly, telling childish stories with no real order, jumping from one thought to the next before finishing the last. She would grab his hand whenever she felt scared, at a strange noise, or simply when she wanted someone to be there. Each time, Mr. Hoan hesitated for just a beat. Not out of annoyance, but because he wasn't used to it. Not used to being trusted by a child so completely. Not used to the feeling of being needed simply for who he was, not for status, not for authority. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the window, the house felt unusually quiet. Nee sat on the floor, playing with colorful puzzle pieces. Mr. Hoan sat nearby, pretending to read the newspaper, though his gaze kept drifting back to that small figure. Suddenly, Nee looked up. She stared at him for a long moment, then asked, her voice so soft it almost dissolved into the air, "Grandpa, do you like me?" The question froze Mr. Hoan in place. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was so real. There was no demand. No accusation. Just a naive, fragile question from a child trying to find out whether she was accepted. In that moment, Mr. Hoan realized something he had never truly considered before. This child had never asked for a title. Never questioned her place in the family. Never demanded recognition. She only needed to be loved. Only needed to know that she wouldn't be left behind. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but to Mr. Hoan, it felt much longer. Old thoughts, old boundaries he had built, suddenly blurred before those clear, innocent eyes. From that day on, change began to appear. Very slowly. But very real. There were no loud apologies. No dramatic declarations of change. Only small, quiet actions, consistent and sincere. Mr. Hoan began to take the initiative and said to James's mother, "This weekend, call me over to play." A sentence that seemed simple. A suggestion that sounded ordinary. But to Diep, upon hearing it, her heart skipped a beat. It was something she had never dared to imagine. Never dared to hope for. She had grown used to keeping her distance, used to expecting nothing so she wouldn't be disappointed. And yet this time, that door had opened, even if only a little. When Nee came over, Mr. Hoan no longer kept his distance. No more scrutinizing looks. No more heavy silence. He sat down to play with her, even if his movements were a bit clumsy. He held Nee's hand while walking around the garden, slowing his steps to match her tiny ones. He patiently listened to her rambling, disjointed stories, even when he didn't fully understand what she was talking about. But he listened. And this time, he was truly there. James watched from afar. He watched his father, the way he bent down to Nee's level, the fleeting smile on a face once so stern, and could hardly believe his eyes. Something was changing. Not loudly. Not hurriedly. But clearly enough that no one could deny it anymore. Diep remained as cautious as ever. Even though changes were happening little by little, even though everything before her eyes seemed to be softening, she still didn't dare let her heart drift toward hope too soon. The years of being rejected, of being placed outside the boundaries of that family, had left her with a habit that was hard to break, always slowing herself by one step, always preparing for the possibility of being hurt again. She understood all too well how painful it was to hope, only to be disappointed. She knew that the more one hoped, the harder it became to stand back up when everything collapsed. Diep was afraid that everything was only temporary. Afraid that this change was merely the aftershock of the recent incident, born from the panic of almost losing little Nee. Afraid that as time passed, as life returned to its old rhythm, the prejudices deeply rooted in Mr. Hoan's thinking would come back again, sharp and cold, as if they had never faded. She feared that one day, the door that had just begun to open would close once more. And when that happened, she would again find herself standing outside, with no reason left to hold on. Diep shared none of these fears with anyone. She didn't complain. Didn't blame. Didn't ask questions. She simply observed in silence. Watching Mr. Hoan's gaze whenever Nee ran past. Watching the way he slowed down when he heard the child call out, "Grandpa." Watching every small, almost trivial gesture, yet enough to show that he was changing, even if he himself might not yet realize it. Each time, Diep reminded herself, don't trust too quickly, don't hope too soon. Because for her, trust had become something extremely fragile. Then, the phone calls began to come more often. At first, it was just a short call in the late afternoon. Mr. Hoan's voice on the other end was still low and measured, as always, no urgency, no explanation attached. "Is Nee free today?" Diep held the phone, her hand trembling slightly. She didn't answer right away. That simple question was enough to make her heart beat faster than usual. She replied softly, as if speaking even a little louder might shatter that fragile moment. "Yes, she is." The call ended quickly. No further words were exchanged. Yet Diep continued to hold the phone long afterward, as if to make sure that what had just happened wasn't something she had imagined. A few days later, there was another call. The same voice. The same familiar brevity. "Have the child come over for dinner this weekend?" No explanation. No roundabout phrasing. And no apologies or acknowledgments for the years that had passed. Yet it was precisely that calm, matter-of-fact tone that made Diep understand. Mr. Hoan was not someone accustomed to speaking gently. Nor was he the kind of person who easily bowed his head to admit his mistakes. For him, taking the initiative to call, extending an invitation, repeating these seemingly small gestures, was already a very big step. It was his way of slowly dismantling the boundaries he himself had once built. Diep understood that this was how Mr. Hoan was learning to accept. Not loudly. Not through declarations. And without needing anyone to witness it. Just slowly, bit by bit, in his own way. Nee's visits to Mr. Hoan's house became more regular. The awkwardness of the early days faded away. The heavy silence that once filled the room whenever Diep appeared was no longer there. Diep continued to keep a small distance for herself. She didn't rush forward. She let Nee run and laugh naturally, while she remained at a boundary close enough to observe, yet far enough not to make things tense. She didn't step into the moments when Mr. Hoan played with Nee. Nor did she try to prove that she was a good mother, or a woman worthy of acceptance. She was simply there. Quietly. Like someone waiting. And perhaps it was that very quietness that allowed everything to unfold more naturally. No one was forced. No one had to choose between right and wrong. Then one day, during what seemed like an ordinary family meal, when everyone was seated around the table, when steam still rose from the dishes, when the room was filled with the familiar sounds of a family dinner, Nee began chattering excitedly about school. She talked non-stop. About her friends. About her teacher. About small, trivial things, yet her eyes lit up every time she saw the adults listening. Mr. Hoan watched her for a long time. His gaze was no longer as stern as before. There was something softer in it, slower, as if he were seeing a familiar image from the past. Then he spoke, slowly. His voice was low, not loud, but clear enough for everyone to hear. She's better behaved than her father was as a child. The sentence settled over the dining table like a pause in time. No one spoke right away. Not because of overwhelming surprise, but because everyone understood what lay beneath those words. James froze for a brief moment. Then he smiled softly. A gentle, unshowy smile, carrying emotions he had kept inside for so many years. Diep lowered her head. She said nothing. But her eyes reddened, her lashes trembling ever so slightly. She didn't need any further affirmation. No clear declaration of acceptance. No belated apology. That single sentence was enough. No one said it out loud. No one needed to explain. But everyone understood. It was little Nee, the child once seen as not of blood, once placed outside the rigid standards of adults, who had brought together a family that had been divided. Not through reasoning. Not through titles or status. But through innocence, through unconditional love, and through her quiet, natural presence in each of their lives. And in that moment, the prejudices that had existed for so many years began to dissolve. When the hearts of those who have long lived by reason and rigid principles begin to soften, new questions inevitably surface, more clearly than ever before. Because change, even when it has begun, is still not enough to completely erase the deep marks left by the past. Some things do not disappear simply because of a brief moment of tenderness, they require time, and many trials, to truly fade away. The barriers that existed for so many years, have they truly vanished? Or have they merely stepped back for now, hiding behind rare smiles, waiting for the right moment to once again test everyone involved? Diep understands that the road ahead is still far from smooth. She does not deceive herself into believing that a few small changes can erase the cold years she once endured. Even though doors have begun to open, even though the gazes directed at her are less distant and harsh, she cannot forget what it felt like to be kept outside, to be treated as someone who did not belong. That feeling is not loud, but it is persistent. Like an old scar that seems healed, yet aches sharply at the slightest touch, reminding her just how much pain once existed. Diep wonders where she now stands within this unfolding change. She is no longer the woman who would sacrifice everything to force her way into a family that refused to accept her. But neither is she brave enough to believe that she has truly been welcomed. Can she truly step into that family? Not as Nee's mother. Not because of the accidental bond the child created. But as herself. As a woman shaped by her choices, her sacrifices, her wounds, and the resilience she has carried through a long journey? Diep knows one thing clearly, her love for Nee is unconditional, and the child's presence has the power to soften many hearts. Yet deep down, she does not want to stand behind her daughter forever, does not want to be accepted only as an attachment. She wants to be seen. To be acknowledged. Not by a title, but through genuine respect. But Diep no longer waits for explicit affirmations. She has learned that some things are more easily lost the more one demands them. Instead of asking, instead of forcing an answer, she chooses to quietly observe, quietly feel, and allow time to respond to what words cannot fully express. Each softened gaze. Each more intentional phone call. Each seemingly small moment of peace becomes a silent piece in a larger transformation. Because sometimes, acceptance does not arrive in a dramatic instant. It is not loud, not theatrical, and needs no declaration. It comes very slowly. as slowly as a heart that once shut itself tight learning to open again, after growing used to protecting itself with coldness. And it is within that slowness that the deepest changes begin to form. Not immediately visible, but persistent enough to be undeniable. Will what is happening now be strong enough to overcome old barriers? Will Diep truly be able to take her place as a daughter within that family, not because of circumstance, not because of a child who connects them, but because of acceptance that comes from the depths of the heart? Those questions remain unanswered. But the very fact that they are being asked is already a sign that nothing is standing still anymore. The answer is still waiting ahead. Stay tuned for the next episode.
Xin chào tất cả mọi người đã quay trở lại với kênh của mình nhé. Mình đang làm video. Cảm ơn mọi người rất nhiều nhé. Hẹn gặp lại mọi người trong những video tiếp theo nhé. Tạm biệt mọi người. 1 phút 20 mấy giây luôn rồi.